I think we might start now. So wherever you are, welcome. My name's David Sequeira. If you haven't met me, I'm the director of the Margaret Lawrence Gallery at the Victorian College of the Arts. And really, it's my pleasure to welcome you to session 2, semester 2 of Art Forum. And before we get underway, I really want to take a moment to acknowledge that, this talk is taking place on land, well, really that long before art, as we know it through the Victorian College of the Arts was even thought about. Actually, the Bunurong and Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, they practice song, dance, ritual, the visual arts for generations before we practiced it here. And we don't take it lightly that we make art and we display art on unceded land. And I really want to extend my welcome, a special welcome to any Indigenous staff and students, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. To our guest speaker, artist and researcher Alex Martinis Roe explores feminist genealogies and seeks to foster specific and productive relationships between different generations as a way of participating in the construction of feminist histories and futures. This involves developing research and storytelling methodologies that employ non-linear understandings of time, that respond to the specific practices of different communities, that experiment with the setup of discursive encounters, and that imagine how these entanglements can inform new political practices. Alex is a former fellow of the Berlin Center of Advanced Studies in Arts and Sciences at the University of the Arts Berlin, and holds a PhD from Monash University here in Melbourne. Alex has recently taken up the position of head of drawing and printmaking here at the Victorian College of the Arts, and wherever you are, please make Alex welcome. Over to you, Alex.
Hello, everyone. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm giving this talk on the lands of the Wurundjeri Willem people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I was born here, but I've recently come back here after living away for 11 years. And in the years ahead, I hope to become a true ally of the Kulin Nations and do what I can to honour their sovereignty and their country. I also need to alert any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people watching that there's a photograph of people later in my presentation that may have passed away. I'll mention that I'm going to show it again just before I do so. I'm really committed to working on the political effects of my work and to using my public voice to generate what I call solidarity in difference. In my talk today, I'm going to speak about a few of my projects over the last decade and the way that I've attempted to structure my practice so as to foreground the relational nature of artistic authorship. I'll also talk about my desire to contribute to cultural change through an attention to the quality of relationships that my work engenders. First, I'm going to talk about the way that I've developed a practice of resonating with other voices as a feminist approach to authorship. This practice of resonating is an attempt to expand my authorship as an artist. I try to acknowledge the other people that formed and become a part of my work, but without losing the specificity of my own voice. This practice of resonating attempts to trouble the normative model of solo authorship in the art world and its role in maintaining fiction of the autonomous subject, the machine of capitalist individualism. I think it's of great importance to create artworks that picture the space between us, an understanding of the self as always in relation to others. This is the ethics that we desperately need in a society structured by exploitation and where care labour continues to be devalued. Attempting this expansion of my artistic authorship has necessarily come up against so many problems of representation. How could I include other people's stories, ideas, and voices in my work without colonising them? These are questions a feminist, decolonial historian or ethnographer must ask, and artists working with socially engaged practices must ask them too, and there are no easy answers. The first work I'll talk about is a modest work I made in 2010, but which marks an important turning point in my practice. It's a conversation transcript called Stenotype. I arranged for 2 participants who had not yet seen each other since being involved in another of my artworks to meet in the gallery before opening hours to discuss their experience. I wanted to test the possibility of including my audience within what is considered to be the artwork. I employed a stenographer to simultaneously transcribe their conversation. Their discussion was private, except for the silent presence of the stenographer. A stenographer records syllables, not letters, so I imagine that perhaps the way that she might listen to their discussion might be somewhat different, perhaps, particularly as she had no prior knowledge of the context of the gallery. Stenographers are trained to record words that they've never heard before because they record the syllables they hear. The stenographer seemed to be, to me, the perfect allegory for the patriarchal idea of femininity, the silent witness who dutifully transcribes the words of others. By focusing on her role in the situation, rather than the speakers, I hope to invert the usual hierarchy between event and document and its sexual politics. As the stenographer presses each syllable key on the stenotype machine, because it's not letters, it's syllables, a roll of steno paper is simultaneously stamped with the corresponding stenography symbol. This paper emerges from the machine as an unequivocal record of the syllables the stenographer has heard. I scanned this roll of steno paper after the conversation and then compiled it into A1 blocks of code. The 45-minute discussion filled 5.5 sheets. I then presented this pinned to the wall along with an audio recording of the inside of the stenotype machine, which is padded and usually inaudible, along with the silent video that focused on the stenographer. Together, these 3 documents form an expanded transcript of the conversation. Stenotype was a way to represent the foreclosed content of the participants' conversation about their experiences of my work, troubling the politics of documentation that attempts to give transparent access to an event. It displayed the ethics that prevented me from publicly sharing content that was not mine, as well as my desire to bring them into the work. It presented me with a problem that shifted my way of working entirely. How could I trouble the model of the solo author if I could not include the voices of others in my work? Collaboration is one answer, but I wanted to find a way to critique the ongoing organisation of the art world around the individual artist by occupying that figure whilst problematising it and expanding the role. Following Stenotype, I embarked on a number of projects which sought to create situations where my audience became my interlocutors, engaging directly with me to construct conditions under which I could bring their voices ethically into my work. In 2011, I set out to explore my female authorial genealogy as a way to make artworks that foregrounded my co-emergence with and contingencies upon other authorships. I contacted people I had been in dialogue with and asked them each to nominate a female author who had been important to her or him to discuss the nature of the impact of this author's work on her own. In this first phase of my project, Genealogies, Frameworks for Exchange, I facilitated a series of online video conference encounters between these writers and readers, which were recorded and then edited in consultation with the participants afterwards. Since when I kind of showed this work because we're all on Zoom all the time at the moment, and I just thought I'd mention that that at the time I was interested in online video conferencing because I liked that the audience watching the recorded conversations didn't have a materially different experience to the participants. So there was no difference in the mediation of the encounter and its document. In telling stories, one of these edited recordings, Razia Paveen, who was at the time a doctoral candidate in English literature at Huddersfield University in the UK, and who had participated in one of my prior projects, nominated Wendy Webster, a British historian, as a key figure in her research. Razia is part of a migrant community in North England from South Asia, which is one of the demographics that Wendy had written about in the book, which was so important for Razia, called Imagining Home. I contacted Wendy and asked if she would meet with Razia on Skype. And it was then by chance that Wendy happened to visit Razia's institution, and so they actually ended up meeting in person. Instead, they met me on Skype and we discussed the parameters of the conversation, and then I left my computer. So I was not present during their conversation, but my computer recorded their encounter. These edited conversations that became public in various formats had a particular beauty and tenderness. The love between these textual mothers and daughters redressed the distance of fandom and presented the real continuity in feminist authorship, showing it to be a collective endeavour true to the politics of the women's liberation movement. In this project, I found that mapping the participants' differing connections to my own authorship meant that I could bring their conversations into the exhibition situation. For Genealogies Frameworks for Exchange, the writings of the Milan Women's Bookstore Cooperative on affidamento had been foundational. The next phase of my practice was concerned with establishing an embodied exchange with the Milan Women's Bookstore Cooperative directly. I wanted to acknowledge their importance to my work and to contribute to more careful intergenerational relationships in feminism. I was concerned by a tendency toward, and I still am concerned by a tendency toward sweeping generalizations about earlier generations of feminist work and progress narratives within feminism, which often repeat the damaging habits of patriarchal history and fragment those with common objectives in the present. What is so important about the Milan Women's Bookstore Cooperative's work is the emphasis they place on what they call the practice of relationships. As the most primary political practice of feminism, the feminist practice upon which all others depend. In particular, they theorize a special kind of relationship between two women called affidamento, or entrustment. As part of the research for my To Become Two project, which includes a series of 6 film installations that can be configured in various ways, a series of workshops and public salons, and a book. So as part of that research, I spent time over several years with the Milan Women's Bookstore Cooperative through frequent visits, learning about affidamento. It's a relationship that exceeds the kinds of relationships found in the existing institutions of family, friendship, and work, and involves a commitment to another woman as a political partner. In that partnership, the two engage in a process of becoming each other's point of reference in their different endeavours. Through this, together they establish a different and female-determined structure of validation. The way of doing this is to refer to and support one another in their different spheres of political practice, giving each other authority in those different spaces through full acknowledgement and support of the other's competences, achievements, and desires. One of my favourite examples that they use to describe affidamento is the relationship between Virginia Woolf and Vita Sackville-West. Virginia was an extraordinary and experimental writer, whereas Vita was the author of bestsellers. And they used each other's different competences to support each other. For example, Vita published one of her bestsellers with Virginia's experimental publishing house, the Hogarth Press, so that the Hogarth Press could afford to publish their more experimental titles. As well, Virginia gave Vita vital criticism that improved her writing. The collective this Milan Women's Bookstore Cooperative is structured by these relationships of affidamento. It's a web of one-on-one relationships in its mode of organisation. So that's its mode of organisation, departing from the well-known horizontal structures of the left. So instead of consensus, decisions are made by an authority that shifts among members according to desire, competence, and trust. So what's significant about these relationships of affidamento when taken as a political model is that collaboration and political alliance is not dependent upon a shared identity. These relationships traverse the borders of identity politics. And the more I learn about different feminisms in different contexts, the more often I find affidamento, although it's often not named. It's certainly not named as affidamento. So my Two Become Two project involved this research with the Women's Bookstore Cooperative and 4 other related feminist communities in Europe and Australia from 2013 to 2017. This was a process of coming to know my own feminist formation, entering into direct, reciprocal and embodied relationships with the feminists that had shaped my politics through reading their books. Specifically, I wanted to trace the social history of how the concept of sexual difference was put into practice, tracing its use by psychanalyse politique in the 1960s and early 70s, and its transfer to the Monash Women's Bookstore Cooperative and their elaboration of it into a model for collective politics, and then the way that this model and practices were taken up in Barcelona, and then how in another simultaneous but different trajectory, the ideas and practices spread from Paris to Utrecht and Sydney. And how these 2 communities in Utrecht and Sydney, in dialogue with one another, developed so many of the key ideas of corporeal feminism, feminist new materialism, and feminist post-humanism. So it's really kind of a social history of ideas and the way that this concept of sexual difference migrated and was elaborated in these different communities over time. The 5 history films also form a kind of essay on the voiceover. So each one approaches the voice and the authority of the storyteller in a different way. And I like to think about each of them as propositions for feminist historiography. I made the first film with the Bookstore Collective in Milan in 2014, titled A Story from Circolo della Rosa. And it's narrated by my own voice and is directed to a close friend and colleague of mine in the form of a letter, telling the story of the affidamento relationship between 2 experimental historians in the collective who began working together on feminist pedagogical experiments in the late 1980s. The reason I told the story of this specific relationship is because over the time that I spent with the cooperative, I developed a committed relationship with these 2 women in particular, and they entrusted their story to me. For each of the films in Two Become Two, the way that I made the films came from actually doing the feminist practices each community had developed. So in this case, affidamento. The story in my film is told like a parable. I left out names and dates to give a sense that the story is one that could apply to many. I included no recordings of my interviews with the 2 women, and I just used footage of the places in the story as they were filmed, as they were when I filmed them in 2014, and in combination with archival photographs and documents. One of the reasons for this is that we were concerned, these 2 historians and I, that their image may be objectified. Viewing habits instilled in us do not easily give authority to older women. In 2017, I completed the last history film about the digestion of continental sexual difference feminism in Sydney in the 1970s and 80s, called It Was About Opening the Very Notion That There Was a Particular Perspective. This 3-channel installation proposes that the reason for the development of transdisciplinary feminist scholarship in Sydney in the 80s is a result of the early published translations of continental sexual difference philosophy, which was read by activist communities involved in a range of interlinked political movements, including feminism, gay liberation, Aboriginal rights, and radical trade unionism, and involved filmmakers, labourers, students, theorists, artists, among others. And the film centres on the philosophy strike, which occurred in 1973 at the University of Sydney after a proposal by 2 PhD candidates to teach a course called Philosophical Aspects of Feminist Thought was rejected. I focus on the alliance that formed between the students and the New South Wales Builders Labourers Federation. It's implied in the film that it is the success of the strike, in part because of the green ban imposed on Sydney University by the Builders Labourers Federation in solidarity with the feminist philosophy students, that set the stage for this special relationship between activist alliances and feminist philosophy in Sydney in the decade that followed. I believe that it's the history of cross-issue activist solidarity that fostered the transdisciplinary trajectory in feminist scholarship in Sydney, which has become what we know as feminist new materialism and by other names. The work also includes excerpts from films by Helen Grace, Margot Nash, and Pat Fisk, which you can see there in the 4:3 channel on the left. I think that their films are examples of the same politics found in feminist new materialism and also as a result of this history. But importantly, these films are situated outside of academia. Just to let Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers know, I'm very soon going to show the photograph I mentioned earlier where people depicted in it may have passed away. The film is narrated by 6 participants in this history and situates their narratives through stories of the housing experiments they lived in, which were the real locations for many of the political alliances that characterised the movement rather than existing institutions. So rather than naming and identifying these protagonists in history, as would be done in conventional historiography, the share houses that they lived in became the protagonists in my film. It's an acknowledgement of how powerful the transformation of domestic structures towards collective and queer kinship models can be. I worked with many people on the research I did with each of the 5 feminist communities for 2 Become 2, and I formed relationships of affidamento with many of these people, some short and intense, others ongoing. The research and making of the history films was a social practice of generating relations between different generations of feminists. And so some of these relationships were relationships that formed with women from the 1968 generation and even older. But it was also so much about the relationships formed with those from my own generation, or at least younger generations than the 1968ers. These people who I formed relationships with chose to learn about, inherit, and publicly narrate those stories with me. Following that process of storytelling with this new network, I wanted to then draw from their knowledges and engage them in a digestion of these ideas and practices as a way to continue the movement and to find out how to enact it now in our own contexts. In 2016, I brought together 22 women who'd worked with me on the historical research. Some of them had helped me with translations and interpreting, some had worked on the narration of the research and performed in the film works I'd made, and some had been my interlocutors about the project more broadly. I brought them together for a 4-day meeting in a country house outside of Berlin to develop propositions for feminist collective practice, which were developed out of a practical experimentation with the historical practices in my research. So I worked with these contributors individually and in smaller groupings in the year leading up to this meeting. We undertook exercises that I had designed to generate experiences of the practice of relations and other practices that developed from it in Milan, Paris, Barcelona, Utrecht, and Sydney. And then I worked with each contributor individually to develop a proposition that elaborated one of her own specific practices, but which was connected to one or more of these historical practices. And then we developed it into something that could be done by many people, into a collective practice. So that meant developing an idea for how feminist politics could be practiced. And then developing a series of exercises to test it out with the group at the meeting. So this is an example of one of these, one of the 22 practices that we developed. The central questions addressed by each of these propositions are, what can we learn from the political, theoretical, and aesthetic practices developed within and among the historical feminist collectives in the 2 Become 2 project? And how can we adapt these practices to our own needs, desires, and contexts? As the framework for the 4-day meeting, we made Our Future Network film like narrative cinema. It was only one take, except for a few exceptions, but each contributor had worked with me in the lead up to develop a plan for when the camera was on and off, and for testing out and the presentation of the proposition that we had developed together. So we also made in advance decisions about what kind of locations we would be using in the house, what angles and actions would the camera capture, you know, and importantly, when would the camera be off. The tension between our commitment to a real process and experience as a group and the time pressure and exhaustion of making a film was intense. But because we were making it together for other audiences, there was a huge level of commitment, and it brought us further than if we hadn't been under that pressure. And I think that the camera played an important role in the bravery, the openness, the eroticism, and the vulnerability we experienced and wanted to share with future audiences. Our Future Network was, as I said, developed through workshops and a salon, and then became a resource for transmitting the process and invention of the group in the film to other contexts. So wherever the films have been shown, or wherever the films in there, you know, all of them together have been shown, audiences become interlocutors and sometimes also contributors to the project. I've also invited new contributors to continue developing the research with me. I see exhibitions as experimental labs to develop the research that I've established, the research that I'm doing, and I've established what I call a flow between production and presentation, disrupting the usual idea of the exhibition as a place for the presentation of something finished. The film installations became resources for that process and provided a kind of situation design to begin new conversations from. Like the Our Future Network film, the salons are highly structured, but also leave space for spontaneity and dialogue and activation of the propositions. The activations in the salon vary in format, including lecture performance, choreography, conversation rules, amateur theatre, and extending to more intimate workshop formats within bigger audiences. There are now 60 propositions in the Our Future Network project. So there are 20 in the film, but now there are 60 which have been developed through these workshops and salons, which I have not yet found a way to communicate those to other to you. Since finishing the Our Future Network film, my focus has been on how to form alliances, practices of collective action and developing collective structures, but among different positions. So in 2018, I made a film called Alliances. 2018 was the 50th anniversary of the attempted revolution in May 1968 in many parts of the world, and I felt it would be an opportunity to expand my knowledge. Where To Become Two had been an investigation of my own feminist formation, which had led me initially to Paris in 2014 to make a film about psychanalyse politique, a subset of the women's liberation movement, which began in 1968. But in 2018, with this new focus on alliances, I felt compelled to learn about other feminist genealogies that were unknown to me, that were part of that history, in an attempt to explore the conditions for greater solidarity across feminisms. So I wanted to do this so as to be able to practice the politics of difference that is so important to me. I wanted to address the embedded structures of the social networks I had inherited and to move outside what I knew. The dominant commemoration of May 68 in 2018 in France was problematic. University executives were using the legacy as cultural capital, while at the same time there were violent repression of student protests. There was also a forgetting of the women's movement that arose as a reaction to the experience of women during the May 68 movement and its hypocrisy. And there was a forgetting of links with the decolonial movements in North Africa. At the same time, in feminism and decolonial politics in France at the moment, there are many generalizing narratives about the women's liberation movement and a lot of division between decolonial feminists and white feminists. My film explores how ethnicity and race have always been concerns of the women's movement. I wanted to find stories of alliances among feminists and decolonial activists that can serve as examples for how to generate alliances now. So I invited 10 committed feminists in the city of Paris today from different positions, backgrounds and professions together to explore the legacy of this women's liberation movement. We worked together over several months. First, each had an encounter with a feminist forebear, her personal link to May 68, which brought new knowledge of, for example, the participation of groups like La Coordination des Femmes Noires, the coordination of Black women within the women's liberation movement. It's important for me to say that two African French women who took part in this project said that they had no link to May 1968 and that they were not represented in that history at all. And that was a very important perspective. Then I decided on pairs in the group and I set them up on blind dates before, so they had never met each other. This was all organized through online video conferencing in advance. They worked in these pairings in person to develop propositions for alliances among themselves. Then when we met for a workshop all together we developed this public salon, which then formed part of the Centre Pompidou's commemorative program for May 1968. So it sort of problematically took part in the dominant commemoration. But we felt it was important to try and be there. So together, the 10 feminist forebears and the 10 answers to the question of what is the legacy of 68 was not a survey, but a very personal and situated way to show the complexity of this history and to point out the work on race, politics and feminism that still needs to be done. I spent time with many in the group to construct double biographies, the story of the relationship between each contributor to the project and her nominated feminist forebear. So I chose to focus in the film on 2 of these double biographies because those two said the most about race, politics and feminism in France. And now the relationship between Karima El Kharaz, a Moroccan-French playwright and stage director, and her forebear, Gerty Damboury, a playwright and novelist originally from Guadeloupe, who was part of the Coordination des Femmes Noires. And Claire Finch, who is an American gender studies PhD student at Paris 8 University, and her forebear, Hélène Sixou, who was also part of the Mouvement de Libération des Femmes, the French Women's Liberation Movement, and who founded the first Women's Studies Centre in France at Paris 8 University. So across the different feminisms that were brought together through this project, there were 2 practices which are central to all of them and which were both necessary for the project to work. And they are, first, to begin working together starting from personal knowledge, the knowledge of experience and not the supposedly universal knowledge of official archives and ideologies. And secondly, committed relationships, where the reason for working together comes from a commitment to one's political partner in all her difference. I think it's very urgent in the current situation globally that those of us who have broadly compatible objectives find ways to form alliances. And I think that this has to begin from putting time and energy into the very accessible, low-tech and intimate space of relationships. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Alex. Just before we take questions, I do want people who have been following the chat that Georgina Binns from our research library has posted some links that relate to Alex's work, genealogies, that are available through the research library resources. So thank you, Georgina, for that. But I want to open the floor up for questions, and I'm just wondering if anybody has a question, and we can do that through the Q&A facility at the bottom of your screen. But does anyone have a question for Alex? Oh, hang on, I've got a question in the Q&A. Here we are. I've got, first question is from Greta Miller. What was the Italian or the French term that Alex used several times maybe to describe relationship?
Yeah. Can you hear me and see me? That's working?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so the term is affidamento. So Teresa de Loretas translates it as entrustment. So the term is affidamento, and it was a term it's a name for an ancient practice, right? So the Milan Women's Bookstore Cooperative put a name to something which they didn't invent, but which they decided to practice intentionally, which is committing to another woman in her difference, and supporting her to undertake her work, her politics, according to her desire.
Right. And another question from Tessa. Hi, Alex, wonderful talk. Could you say something about your own genealogy, like your own inspiring women and philosophers?
I mean, I think my work is all about my own genealogy. Could you clarify, do you mean people who might be referencing my work?
I don't know. Tessa, are you there, Tessa?
I mean, yeah, I guess that has happened, if that's the question. I mean, for example, Bonnie Honig, the political theorist from, I think she's at Brown University, contacted me, a couple of, oh, I see. Yeah, anyway, so there are people who've been influenced by me, but no, the question was actually who has directly inspired me.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the Milan Women's Bookstore Cooperative, right? So, and I discovered them when I was 20 years old. I was in I studied at Monash University in Caulfield, and I was in the library trying to find this book on Irigaray, because Luce Irigaray, the Belgian feminist philosopher, is also a really important inspiration for me. And and I stumbled across this text by Luisa Muraro, who's one of the women in the Milan Women's Bookstore Cooperative. And what I loved so much about their ideas was how practical it was. It was like turning all of Irigaray's philosophy into something so tangible, into a practice that I could do myself. And as an artist, I was always looking for how to do things practically, and how to live the ideas. And that was why I loved the Milan Women's Bookstore Cooperative so much.
Well, the questions are flooding in. Here are a couple from Vicky. First, thanks for a terrific presentation. Obviously, the issue of racialized difference within feminism in Australia is key, and I wonder if you plan to continue the project now that you're back. And then secondly, how do you see the practice of affidamento as a practice we might embrace within the institution, that is, with student-supervisor relationships, etc.?
Wow. Yeah, two really great questions. I think the first one is David, could you repeat the wording for me?
So the first one is the issue of racialized difference within feminism in Australia is key. And I wonder if you plan to continue the project now that you're back in Australia.
So no, I don't continue to continue the same projects that the Two Become Two project in Australia. I do plan to continue working on alliances, and I have been working on it here. But it's complicated because I feel that the structure of my authorship needs to change again in order to make that possible. And it's such a big leap. It's something I'm working on, and I've been practicing being an ally in whatever way I can. Please ask me that again in a year's time, and hopefully I'll have a more coherent and longer answer. But yes. And then your second question, about relationships between students and teachers. Is that right? I think that it's an amazing model for pedagogy. Absolutely. I think that there are certain boundaries in the teacher-student relationship which are very important to maintain. I think that there's actually in the education relationship a type of authority which is necessary, and that sounds that would be kind of controversial to some, but I'm taking the concept of authority from Hannah Arendt, where she differentiates it from totalitarianism. So she says that in the 20th century, totalitarianism and authority have been confused. And she's, and although we don't need to keep authority in the same structures that it has historically been in, it is actually necessary for people to be able to perform a role without that role itself being taken into question constantly, because otherwise it just makes that it makes the learning process impossible to some degree. So that's not to advocate for the master teacher role at all, but just to say that an acknowledgement of the differentiation of the roles is very important. And that idea is behind what the Milan Women's Bookstore Cooperative mean when they talk about authority and the way that they structure their collective through female authority. This kind of, so in the affidamento relationships that I've had in other contexts, I would say that there's much more of a kind of an openness and a flow that I think is potentially possible in the student-teacher relationship. But nevertheless, I think the commitment to each other, the idea of committing to each other in your difference and submitting yourself to the potentially destabilizing nature of that encounter is where education can really take place. So yes, I think affidamento is an amazing concept to work on in teacher-student relationships, but it has to be refined for the context.
Another question, this is from a fellow Alex. Alex, the installation of your work videos is quite distinct. I was wondering if you could speak about your decision-making in relation to the presentation of your work.
So you might be thinking there about the To Become Two installations, which I presented quite a few images of, which is like those powder-coated purple modular structures. That's a collaboration with Fotini Lazaridou-Hatzigoga. She's she studied architecture, but she's a curator. She's a social practice artist. She can't be defined. We decided I came to her because I said, Fotini, I really want to generate an exhibition that has its own architectural logic. It's I wanted To Become Two to be able, you could put it absolutely anywhere and it would have its own character. So rather than relying on or responding overly to exhibition spaces, I wanted it to be have this kind of sense of the spaces that activists create with whatever they have available to them. So you might kind of rent like an old house, but turn it into this like amazing center for gay liberation or something. And like the nature of the four walls doesn't really matter that much. It's what you do inside them. And so that's what I wanted to create. And Fotini, I knew would be fantastic at helping me realize that. So we chose purple, for example, because we thought, oh, it's like a fun feminist color and it kind of feminizes these otherwise rather brutish looking kind of hardware store, what do you call them? Aluminium profiles. Yeah.
Great. There are lots of questions coming in. This one's from Simone. How do you begin? Thank you for such an inspiring art forum, Alex, which is so relevant and gives such hope for our times. This is a practical question. how do you begin to decide and then contact people to build these relationships? And at what point does this research develop into the artwork?
So it depends on the project. So with To Become Two, it was very clear to me quite early on what I was doing, which was tracing the migration of these ideas. So it was not random, like these 5 feminist communities. Like, I mean, I hesitate to say that, you know, they are the key communities in this history, but I think they are, you know, and so I knew from my they were, I guess, like centers that generated the ideas that I was interested in mapping. So it was literally driven by my feminist bibliography. I was looking at what are the ideas that have formed my thinking, and I'm going to go meet those people and figure out how ideas migrated amongst them and explore that social history. So in that case, it was driven by my bibliography, and the people that I met in those contexts were already interested in those histories themselves. So, you know, sometimes, like I would contact, for example, the Barcelona group. I had a couple of contacts that were given to me there from the Milan Women's Bookstore Cooperative. So literally, you know, like women in their 70s who had known each other back in the day and still kept in contact. And they, they put me in touch. And then, you know, I was like, well, how can I afford to go? So I'll contact this, curator I know who has an apartment that she, runs a residency out of. And okay, she's like, yeah, great, come and stay. So I went and lived in Barcelona for a few months at Bar Project residency there. And the curators who run that program, there are 3 of them, they were really happy to help me, and so there were all these people who were already kind of invested in helping me when I arrived. And then, it kind of mushroomed from there, like I would be like, oh, I really need someone to come with me on Tuesday to translate this conversation. And so someone would be like, oh, I've got a friend who could do that. And they'd call that friend. And then, that would be how it happened. And invariably, people who became involved for practical reasons also had a kind of an interest in the history and became involved in the content. And then, as I said, in the case of the Alliances project, the way of finding people was very different. For that project, for that first phase of the Alliances project in Paris, I relied on the networks of curators that I was working with at the Centre Pompidou to help me find these prominent feminists. So they're quite well-known people. So that was how it was done. I mean, in different cases, different answers. Yeah.
Great. Another question, this is from Norrie. Thanks for the wonderful talk and sharing access to your really exciting and important practice. I was especially happy to hear you talk of solidarity and women's liberation, which is part of my own history, but the terms seem to have been lost with the turn to feminism. And I'm wondering what you think about the relationship between women's liberation and feminism, and how you deal with this in your own work.
So, Norrie, thank you for that question. That question is at the heart of To Become Two. I was absolutely 100% motivated to locate the ideas in the practice of feminism as a social movement. So I did, and I was motivated by that because of a sense that feminism had become kind of separated according to industry, and I don't think that that's happened. I think in academia, for example, because of the demands of being an academic, like if you become a feminist philosopher, you have to spend so much time doing administration and like meeting certain performance requirements and all this stuff, and you've had to learn the dominant language of the institution, and it becomes difficult to retain connections to feminists in other contexts because the demands of that sphere that you've entered to try and change take up all your time. And feminists in academia are brilliant at organizing amongst themselves, right? So there's a lot of solidarity and kind of social movement really that happens amongst feminist academics, but not a lot of crossover to feminists in other contexts, industries, and so on. And I was really motivated to find ways that, you know, we didn't kind of lose the important new work that had been happening in each of those different contexts, like academia or, you know, social work or whatever it is, but find more ways to bring them together with a kind of consciousness of the roots of all of that work in the women's liberation movement as a social movement. So yeah, so I do think that feminism is rooted in women's liberation, obviously, and I think that there are many people within it who want to feel that as a grassroots movement again. Yeah, so I do think that the relationship between women's liberation and feminism is improving. I do, and I think that's out of necessity. I think that's out of joy. Yeah, and I try in my work to basically make the practices that people are doing now, especially in academia and the arts, livable beyond the borders of those contexts.
We've got like I've still got about 5 questions, but I'm just gonna finish up with this last question, and perhaps Alex, or maybe I could put my email address in the chat, or perhaps we could put your email in the address in the chat, because people are really interested in your work and where you're taking that. But Elisa's asked this question that says, "Hi Alex, great to hear about your work. Could you talk a bit about your thoughts for the drawing and printmaking department?"
Not yet, I'm sorry, no, because I do think that whatever happens in drawing and printmaking is going to be a collaborative project. And I've only been in the job a month, and we simply haven't had time to work on that together. So whatever comes out will be the product of a community, not my singular vision.
Well, look, firstly, thank you to everybody who has been, shared this art forum with us today. Really, really thank you. And thank you so much for your engagement. I'm gonna, if your question wasn't answered, I'm gonna put my email address into the chat, and you can send that question to me, and then I'll pass that on to Alex. Is that a useful way of doing that, Alex? Would that be all right?
Please do, yeah.
Great. Alex, really, thank you so much for Art Forum today. Like, really, it's just, it's so great to have somebody share the sort of, intensely human and social aspects of their practice with us, as particularly at this time when we're in lockdown all across the city. So thank you so much for your generosity. And I also want to take the moment to say how thrilled we are that you're part of VCA, and really on behalf of everybody here, but especially on behalf of the staff, extend to you a very, very warm welcome to the VCA family. So thank you again for today.
And can I just thank you, David, and everyone for making me feel so very welcome. It's been a wonderful start.
Great. Well, if you've had a question that you didn't get answered, here's my email address. It's just going into the chat. But please join us again next week for Art Forum. Our guest speaker is Tony Albert. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Spread the word, and we look forward to seeing you next week at Art Forum. Thank you. Cheers.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. I'm just closing up the session.